by some medical school deans of admissions. So all the deans can go ahead and turn on your cameras, get ready to go. We are so excited to have you. Thank you so much for being here. This is a really, really exciting opportunity for our attendees to hear a little bit from your perspective about what you are looking for in potential applicants to medical school. So for this Q&A session, we're going to be using the Q&A function on Zoom. So we already have so many questions. Thank you all for being so engaged, but please use that function to ask your questions. And Dr. Dan, our moderator, is going to be looking through that and choosing the questions that our deans are going to be answering today. So we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So for now, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Dan Katz.
Thanks so much. Hey, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. My name's Dan, and I am a second-year internal medicine resident, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. We're joined by three incredible deans and admissions experts here, and I want to give everyone the chance to ask questions in that Q&A, and I'll be looking through that. But first, I was hoping that the deans could introduce themselves. We can go one by one and just quickly sort of say where you're from and what your role is. So if we can start with Dr. Osborne. You're muted.
Oh my God, I already failed my mute challenge for the morning. It's Saturday. Hello, I'm Megan Boysen Osborne. I am the Associate Dean for Students. So I oversee admissions, student affairs, and diversity, equity, and inclusion at University of California, Irvine.
Awesome. Dr. Liotta.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'm Rob Liotta, and I'm the Associate Dean for Admissions and Recruitment at the Uniformed Services University, the Health Sciences, and we're actually on the Walter Reed Bethesda Medical Campus, the National Naval Medical Center, Bethesda. So, and I'm great to be here with you today.
And Dr. Amiri.
Hi, everyone. I'm Layla Amiri. I'm the Associate Dean for Admissions at the Robert Larner College of Medicine at the University of Vermont.
And again, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I actually have a quick first question that I was hoping to ask Dr. Osborne. Can you actually give a few stories or sort of say if you've seen any particular red flags on applications and how you respond to those types of things?
Yeah, I think that red flags are a big deal because I think that I don't know if the other associate deans for admission will agree, but 95% of people, 99% of people are going to do awesome. And I don't know necessarily that I'm always looking for that one superstar that's going to go change the world. I just want medical students who are going to do well in my curriculum. And I would much rather have 114 awesome, above average, amazing medical students than have 105 superstars and 9 medical students who are having a lot of trouble. So I think trying to identify those students who are going to have trouble either professionally or academically are oftentimes what I'm looking for in an application, trying to weed out some medical students for those who I think may not be successful at medical school. So some red flags that I see on applications are just number one, attention to detail. Medicine is a very detailed specialty. You have to make sure that you checked all your orders. They're for the right patients. You didn't accidentally put 2 milligrams in instead of 1 milligram. So when I see a lot of errors on applications, spelling errors, things like that, it makes me think that they didn't put the time in and this wasn't important to them. I've actually seen people send in drafts of their personal statement where there were things in parentheses like notes to themselves that they said, write about personal experience here in their personal statement. So obviously that's something that is not going to make it past the screening stage. So that's number one. Number two is letters of recommendation that clearly don't know the student or don't speak to them personally. I think that it's really important to choose your letter writers well, and those who are going to write you a strong letter of recommendation. There's nothing worse than a kind of milquetoast letter of recommendation, so to speak. We like to see strong letters of recommendation. We kind of expect that. So that would be another thing. I have several other things that I can think of, but for the sake of time, I will pass it on back to you, Dr. Dan.
Awesome, thank you. That's a great answer. And we have another question now for Dr. Amiri here from Ikeno, who says, what reason or reasons do students cite the most for why they would like to attend your school specifically?
So the University of Vermont has a very social justice driven mission. And I know that that's true of many of the medical schools that we have. And when you put it in the context of the state, it even becomes more evident how social justice, all of the activities that we engage in are. So one would be that a student who would be interested in the social services types of efforts that our institution is involved in. And the second one was an understanding of the unique culture that we have in the state of Vermont. So the entire state is considered a rural state. And so we're focusing a lot on increasing access to care, taking care of rural communities. And so those are the types of things that would resonate with us and the admissions committee, because we know it's a person who's really committed to what we have at the institution. And the third and most important one in my mind is the professionalism mission statement that we have for the institution. And so we expect individuals who join us to adhere to the professionalism, to the stated professionalism statement that we have for the institution, which is embedded in cultural humility, kindness, and respect. And so I look for that in the application. I look for that in all communications with us, and obviously when students join us on recruitment day.
Great, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And the next question, and we have a lot of questions going, so we're going to try to get through as many as possible. It comes to Dr. Leota. Somebody, an anonymous attendee, writes a question about research, which oftentimes comes up. And they write, as someone not super interested in research, is that something that will work against me?
That's a great question. And I think with looking at research, obviously all medical schools look at it and it's a plus on your application when you have it. However, I think if research isn't your that's not your big desire, that you want to go really into more of the clinical side and be a clinician, I think you need to look at the missions of the schools you're going to be applying to. And there are certain schools that really have a research focus or clinician scientists. And then there's some that really focus on the clinical side of medicine. And so I think the big key will be is to actually go look through those missions of those schools. And when you see those missions that really fit with your mission, that really focus on the clinical side of things, those are the schools you're going to want to apply to, and maybe not spend money on the schools that really have a big research focus. But I think so that really answers it. And I think you can get in. You don't have to have a huge research interest. I think everyone that gets into medicine will be doing research. And so we know that at our medical school, but our primary mission is to care for those who go in harm's way and to be really good clinicians. And so if you're going to have a weakness in your application with us and it's just in research, we will look at people who don't have a lot of research experience. And if we see some great other areas where you're really fitting with our mission, you're going to be still a strong applicant.
Awesome. And Dr. Osborne, there's actually a question from someone named Megan, actually, who asks, how can we stand out in our applications and essays when many of the pre-med experiences are similar?
That's a great question. I think a tough question, Megan. So I think that number one, it's good to have all those check boxes like you're talking about, and that makes it so that it's kind of easy to screen your application and find that you've had some research, had some clinical experience, have met some academic benchmarks that we're looking for, as well as shown a commitment to the community. I think I would say that it's different for every single admissions committee member. So I myself, as an admissions committee member and as associate dean for students, I don't have any power at all, actually. So I'm just a member of a committee. And it would actually be really problematic if I had all the power to decide who comes into medical school and who doesn't. So I leave it up to my committee. So every single one of my committee members is going to have a little something different that they're kind of looking for. Like, so for example, when I see someone who was a 4-year athlete and they were still able to be successful in undergrad with a great GPA, still get some volunteer experience, that's like a fun application to me. That's something that kind of stands out and it's exciting. And other things that I love on an application, I love seeing orientation leaders. I don't know why that excites me so much. Maybe I had a great experience with my orientation leader when I was in college, but I just think that shows that you're committed to the school that you're going to be a fun participant in our medical school. And so I think it's not any one thing, but it's just maybe something that you've shown a little bit outside of that clinical or that research experience that was a little something extra. Being in the associate student body, maybe like the student body treasurer or something like that at your college. I love students who are involved in their undergrad institution are going to show me that they are going to give back. But that's one of many things that could stand out. I think just what's that thing that you're passionate about and do it really well and make that shine in your application.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer. And so we're getting a lot of questions about different topics. One topic, though, I see that was mentioned here is that, the application cycle happens and then there's still other, there's other experiences that a student may be doing. So Dr. Amiri, this question will be for you then. As a junior applying this cycle, Libby asks, I have plans this summer to do research and volunteer more. Is there a way to show this future work on my application?
That's a great question, Libby. And yes, there is. MCAS actually allows you to put future hours. So you can put your activity in there and indicate how many of hours you will have and submit your application that way. And then I also think it would be a really good idea for you to see which schools will accept updates from you, and if they will, just to have a follow-up. Because if you're giving us a promise of this work, you haven't really experienced it, so you can't tell us what you've seen, what you've done, and most importantly, what you've learned from it. So if you can provide us an update after 3 to 4 months of having been engaged in the experience, that'll be great. You just need to check with the institution. Some schools don't accept updates at all. Some do. Some will only accept them after you've interviewed. So you'll have to figure out how to navigate that, but definitely let us know what's in your future as well. We understand that coming by all of these experiences isn't that easy for everyone. So let us know what's coming forward as well.
And if I could add to that, Dr. Dan, that was an awesome answer. I agree with everything. I'd also just like to add that sometimes this is why kind of a gap year benefits students. And I really recommend that students take 2 gap years. I'm sure that everybody has a different opinion, especially on this panel, even. I'm sure every single person probably has a different opinion on that. But my recommendation to students is always to have 2 gap years. So number one, that first gap year is getting that experience that you can now put on your application and have a letter of recommendation from. I think it's really nice when you have a big activity to have a letter of recommendation from that. And so if it's projected or future, we're not going to see that letter of recommendation. So this is why sometimes applicants who have had 1 or 2 gap years do have an advantage in the application cycle, because they can spend that first year getting all those experiences, and then they have letters of recommendation to show for it. Then they can project those hours in that second year, but already have some foundation in it.
Yeah, and then Dr. Leota, could you actually expand on what our other 2 admissions experts here have been talking about too? Because, what do you look for specifically in a non-traditional applicant or somebody who has taken gap years, right? Because that application could look a little bit different compared to somebody who's applying straight out of college.
Yes, for sure. And I'll be honest with you, and this is what as one of my advice is, share us your experience. And so those non-traditional students, I think they're some of the best applicants because they have this well-rounded life experiences that they're bringing to medicine. And they often have great leadership experiences. They have great maturity. And so don't think you're abnormal if you're a non-traditional student. In fact, those are some of the best applications I read, because I'm like, oh my goodness, they were the scientist, or they were all these different things. And there's no really perfect application. Like, I think a lot of students think they need to tell us what they think we want to hear. And I think sometimes it's just a beautiful passion. And even if it's a circuitous route, it's beautiful to watch and to see how this manifestation of this interest in medicine developed throughout their career. So I would say, share us that story, and don't be shy about it. Really give us, if you're a little non-traditional, in that personal statement, pick the 3 big events that got you here, and really share with us that, where your thought processes were when you were bringing there. So I think that's what we really like. And especially at our school, we have a lot of non-traditional students that were prior pilots or submariners and, Green Berets and SEALs. And so that they just have wonderful experiences and they bring it to medicine, that stuff.
Great, thank you. And so another big topic that I think can stress people out sometimes is getting letters of recommendation. And we briefly mentioned them, but I see a few questions here about letters of recommendation, who to get them from, professors from the school or outside activities, and in general, how to approach kind of getting the letter of recommendation. So Dr. Amiri, could you talk a little bit more about what you look for in letters of recommendation or advice for how to obtain them?
Absolutely. So my first piece of advice is, check with the schools and see what letters they're requiring, because it'll vary from school to school. Having done this work for some time, I realize that it's difficult to get letters when the school has specific requirements. So again, take a look at the schools that you think you're interested in and see who you'll need letters from and begin working on those letters. I think I'll speak for more than just myself when I say we want letters from people that know you. So when you get a letter from a faculty member where, it's 3 pages long and about 2 1/4 pages are about that individual and their grants and how their class is really hard. And then at the end, it says, well, they sat up front, they got an A and they should get in. That really doesn't help your application. It doesn't hurt you generally in the processes, but it doesn't help you either. So get letters from people that know you, and letters from individuals that know you well and who are willing to provide you a strong supportive letter. So don't be shy in asking for a strongly supportive letter, and the letter that can talk to us about your intellectual capacity, your curiosity. I mean, we had the question about research earlier, and so that's fine if you weren't interested in research. We all want the physician who's curious, right? Because that's what gets you to the decision, and that's what gets you to the diagnosis. And so maybe the people can talk about your curiosity, or they can talk about your leadership. We definitely want someone who can talk about your character. All of the standardized, personality tests that you hear about and schools are requiring really don't speak about how you are. They speak about your knowledge of knowing how to do things. They don't tell us how you function. So a person who can talk to us about how affable you are and how pleasant you are and how able to careful listener you are. So those are the types of letters that really help the application. The other things we have, AMCAS application is pretty thorough. So we have a lot of information about you. What we need is other things that will help us understand you and appreciate you for the amazing person that you are and the great applicant that you are and the promise that you bring to the profession. If you're wherever you are in your career, I think if you're a freshman, sophomore right now and logging on, begin looking at those faculty members that you really like taking classes with, who talk about their research, and start going to office hours. It gets lonely sitting there in the office hours without students coming by, right? And it's not uninterrupted because we can't set that time aside for reading or something. Walk in, talk to your faculty members, be engaged so that they'll have more to say about you than the standard that pops up. For my particular program, and if it's okay for me, Dr. Dan, to say this, I've switched from requiring particular letters to leaving it up to the applicants. Provide 3 academic or professional letters from people that know you well. So that rests with you. And don't request letters from people that you may have had negative experiences with. It's surprising to me how sometimes applicants will request letters from individuals that they've had some negative experiences with, and that sometimes bleeds into the letter as well. And clearly you don't want that to be part of your letter that we receive.
100%, yeah. Dr. Osborne, I think either you're muted or there you go.
I was just telling my family that I'm on a webinar right now and I can't answer any related questions.
No worries. Well, I have a question for you while you're unmuted.
Okay.
Which I also see a few times listed in sort of different ways, but medical school applications are obviously extremely competitive, and sometimes somebody might apply and not get in during a cycle. So when you're sort of evaluating kind of like a reapplicant or someone who has applied in the past, are there specific things about that situation that you're looking into, or what advice would you give a reapplicant?
So first of all, I would tell a reapplicant, do it. Like if this is your goal, like let's go. So I am shocked at how many reapplicants we accept every year, and I don't mean shocked. I'm just surprised. I'm like, wow, like 30% of our acceptances of our incoming class is reapplicants. So it's a big number. So don't feel, obviously you're going to feel a little bit frustrated when you don't get in the first time, but don't feel like your career is over and you're never going to get in. We've accepted people who have applied 4 times, 3 times, and tons who have applied 2 times. So I would say make sure keep going on the path if this is the right path for you. So take a good look at your application. And if you can, get advice from someone who looked at your application in the previous cycle. So if there's an admissions committee member or an admissions counselor who's willing to meet with you to talk to you about what the deficiencies are on your application, then take advantage of that. And it could be anything. It could be GPA, it could be your research experience, it could be clinical experience. I think the most common thing is it being a clinical experience, and that clinical experience wasn't significant enough. Or let's say you got 15 interviews and you didn't get any acceptances. Something was wrong with the interview. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to do it in the future. It just means that you really need to work on your interviewing. And so I would actually recommend, if you can have a coach or a friend or someone who can be candid with you for feedback and put you in that simulated interview experience and tell you and be honest with you and tell you, this is what you're doing. You didn't answer this question thoroughly enough. You aren't looking, you're not giving the person eye contact, or you're having some unsuccesses when you're on Zoom or something like that. So that would be interviews one, clinical experience is obviously another. So we're looking to see like what you did to improve your application in that year off. If you kind of just continued to do the same thing and didn't get much more clinical experience, I would say that is probably predicting another unsuccessful application. But if you've really looked at your application and improved many aspects of it, I think that would be really helpful. And along those same lines, I know I'm answering really long, but post-bac. So if your GPA is not consistent with the GPAs that have been successful in getting into medical school in the past, and I actually put a chart that's really helpful by the AAMC in the Q&A that everybody can look at to see what the acceptance rate is for certain GPAs. I think a post-bac is really important. And I personally, and again, this isn't true for the other panelists, but I personally prefer a post-bac to a master's program. And the reason being is that post-bac will actually improve your science GPA, whereas sometimes master's degree programs don't improve that science GPA. And we also, our school looks solely at the post-bac GPA. If you had a very successful post-bac experience with a lot of units, we consider that GPA separately. Even if it didn't improve your GPA overall, we will look at that GPA separately. So that's something that I think applicants can do if they need to improve that GPA.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Dr. Osborne. And so, you sort of mentioned activities that people can do as well a little bit. And I think over the last few years, it has been a little bit more challenging to get certain activities and experience and shadowing because of COVID. And Dr. Liotta, this is a question for you then. How does the fact that it's been more difficult to get those experiences affect, how you view applicants right now? Because it has been a little bit more difficult to get shadowing and things like that. So what would you recommend students do who may not have been able to get those same experiences?
Yeah, if you haven't, I think that's the updates, because I think, you continue to work at that. And I also would say, just think outside the box, but in the sense that things that aren't traditionally thought of as clinical experiences, hospice work, a hospice volunteer, and dealing with families, that's very clinically oriented in your ability to work there. Also taking care of loved ones. So you can think outside of the box of what have you been involved with outside of the traditional shadowing or scribing, but that actually are clinically related. I even and these are people who are certified nursing assistants. I love it. Like, that's hard work, and it shows grit, and it shows that they're really dedicated to taking care of patients. Some of those are the best clinical experiences. And throughout COVID, they needed people to do that. And those were so those are the things that I'm seeing that are still coming through, that we really we've expanded. We've looked at that. We've expanded those clinical experiences, recognizing that these are all ways that people could have served and worked. EMT work, paramedic squads. Those are all great other experiences, I think, as well. And then even allied health professions, a radiology tech or a pharmacy tech or an anesthesia tech. And those are jobs, paid jobs that people were doing and things like that as well.
Awesome, thanks. So, and you mentioned a green flag in there. So Dr. Amiri, actually, I want to ask you about green flags, because I already asked Dr. Osborne about red flags. But here, Adriana asks, are there specific sort of things that are considered green flags on applications that you look for? Like, for example, speaking multiple languages or other things?
So, that example in particular, speaking multiple languages, it's added value, obviously, particularly for, an institution that it's in a multicultural setting. So for the student and the providers to be able to, provide care in multiple languages, obviously is a huge benefit. I don't know that I would call that a green flag. In my mind, a green flag is, this applicant's a no-brainer and we should move forward with them, similar to where a red flag is, we're stopping the application right here. In terms of added value, that's absolutely exceptional. I mean, the green flag for me is there isn't one particular thing, it's the entirety of the application. So you heard earlier about, make sure that your application is well read and all of those things. As a holistic approach to giving a green flag, for me, it is that everything in the application makes sense, right? So there's a story here, and then the story is presented in the personal statement, and then what the applicant has done really informed what they had said in their personal statement. And so all of these things are coming together. And this is an individual who's been very intentional, who's been very thoughtful, and really hasn't grabbed at things because they know these are things that they should have, but they've been selective in that, they know we need clinical experiences. And so what kind of clinical experiences have they looked for? Or we know that leadership is important for us. What types of leadership activities have they moved into? So I look for an application that's completely cohesive. And I think one of the panelists said earlier, if you have a major activity, you should try your best to get a letter from that person because they'll know you well.
Right, exactly. And so about sort of activities that may not be as related to medicine, though, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Leota, Nicholas here writes, is it worthwhile to discuss hobbies that you find unique and influential for yourself, but that might not really be medicine related? And where would you sort of discuss that?
So I think those are very helpful, and we like to see hobbies. It's actually part of those, that added dimension to your application. So those, I think, and that's where I say, like, present us who you are, right? And if that's a big part of your life, even if you think it's not medicine related, but it's what you're going to bring to our school. And so we love to see that and to say, oh, what they have this great, and you're allowed to have outside interests. You don't have to have all medicine as all your interests. And we really actually like that diversity. So I would say you would share that in your activities. And then even the things that you think aren't really related, like, don't, and this is a problem I sometimes see, is people don't share enough. They don't use up all of their activities, or they combine activities. And I'm like, oh, you could have split this into 4 and given us more details on each of these experiences with that. So I would say broaden those things. And, simple thing like being a waitress or a waiter, right? Like, you think, oh, that's not really medically related. And I'm like, well, no, you're dealing with customers and who, that's how you deal with the patient. You have to listen, you have to deliver, you have to know what they need. That's what you need to know with your patient. So some of these things that you think don't mesh, they do. And if you tell us about that, or how you dealt with an irate customer, or how you dealt with when you made an error, that you made an error with their order, and how you were able to respond. You're going to have that in medicine. You aren't going to be perfect all the time. And what happens when you have to come and say, we made a mistake today with that? So these are all beautiful skill sets that aren't really thought to be medicine related.
Can I just emphasize that answer very, very much? I was a waitress at Applebee's for many years, and I'm an emergency physician now, and there are so many similarities in the two jobs. So I would absolutely agree with that answer.
Yeah, awesome. And Dr. Osborne, while we have you here as well, quick question. And it's something that I actually heard about a lot when I was applying to medical school too, is the fact that some students may do the first few years of college at a community college and then transfer to another institution, or they may take certain classes at different colleges or during the summer. What are your thoughts about that, and how do you view it when you're evaluating a candidate?
Yeah, great. Yeah, go to community college, save some money the first 2 years of your undergrad, because there's a lot of money that you're going to have to spend over the next few years, and not a lot of money that you're going to make when you're a resident. So I would absolutely recommend going to community college. I think what I'm looking for is just to make sure that you had some rigorous science courses at a four-year university and you were successful in those. Someone asked in the chat, can they do a makeshift post-bac rather than a post-bac that's through a program? And I think absolutely. I think what we're looking for though is those rigorous courses in a four-year university, especially if that four-year university is known to the medical school that you're applying to. For example, if someone were to take 2 years of community college and then transfer to a four-year university, have a great GPA in that junior and senior year in rigorous science courses, then that's looked no differently than if someone spent all 4 years at that four-year university. And as an adjacent answer, if someone wants to improve their GPA because maybe they weren't successful in undergrad, I would probably, however, not recommend it. In order to improve the overall GPA, I mean, you might consider taking community college classes, but what I really want to see is I want to see that you're able to handle those four-year university science courses. And so I am going to want to see some courses from, for example, here in California, UCLA Extension or UCI or something like that. That's really going to show me that you can handle the rigors of medical school after maybe you didn't have quite as successful undergrad GPA as you wanted to.
Right. Thank you so much for that answer. And something else that stresses people out, stressed me out too, when I was applying was writing a personal statement. And Dr. Amiri, Rinka here asks a particular question about personal statements, but I was hoping you could expand upon it too. When she asks, for medical school personal statements, I was told to write it as a sort of term essay instead of a narrative where I list out reasons why I'm qualified as a med student. Is this true? Or, what recommendations would you give when someone's writing a personal statement? And what have you seen in the best ones?
So you're going to get as many pieces of advice and different types of advice with as many people that you talk to, because we're going to look for different things. In my mind, if you revisit the things that you've done, you've wasted your space, because we already have an experiences section where you've talked about the things that you've done. So revisiting the things that you've done is, in my mind, not helpful. Also telling me why you're qualified to be a physician is not helpful, because leave that to us and our admissions committees, right? You have assumptions on what makes you qualified, and those may not fit the model that all the different schools have. Allow us to make that determination. An ideal personal statement for me is one that you could, find someone out on the street, give them, 10 or 20. It used to be $5 when I started doing this work, but with inflation, give them $20 so they can have a couple of cups of coffee. Have them read the statement and then see if they come back with the essence of why this is what you must do, that nothing else will work, right? If they come back with that, then that's the personal statement. So I want to understand why it must be medicine just as much as your parents, your significant other, your sister, your brother, and your advisor knows. That's what the point of the personal statement is in my mind, is for me to understand why this has to be where you're going. So I find those personal statements that outline the qualities of a good physician not helpful, and particularly because, committees have different personalities, and depending on how many people are there, who's going to feel uncomfortable about what you've indicated is a, characteristic of a physician. So I think if you can just share with us heart to heart why this is where you need to be, that would be fantastic. It doesn't have to be an exercise in creative writing. It doesn't have to start with, thunder and lightning and, people clutching their chest either. It can be just a very mellow, just again, open heart to heart description of why medicine is your calling. And for many of you, it may not be, it was an instantaneous thing. It may be something that has, grown over time. We heard about traditional applicants, and I completely agree with Dr. Leota. Traditional, non-traditional applicants, are the cream of the crop as far as I'm concerned as well, because there's a life there that they've lived, and they've done something that hasn't been their calling. And so that's what, in my mind, that's where the personal statement should be. And don't use ChatGPT. I was waiting for this to come up, so it didn't come up, and we're halfway through, so I had to bring it up. Don't use ChatGPT. It's probably going to write a pretty decent essay for you. But as we begin to filter through this type of, technology that's available to us, it should really be your words. Nothing is more unsettling for me anyway, as an admissions dean, is when a student comes in to interview and they sound and feel different than what that essay sounded and felt like. So the essay should be reflective of you. Think about a good book that you've read. You kind of have a sense of who that author is, right? If you meet them in person, kind of have an expectation of how they'll be. That's what I would love to read. I want to be breathless and dying to meet you when I'm done reading your personal statement.
Wow, I really actually want to stay on this topic because personal statements they're really challenging to sit down and start writing. And, I've heard even the first draft that you write will look nothing like your final draft, maybe. So Dr. Leota, I want to ask you next and then Dr. Osborne after. What are your thoughts on personal statements and what advice would you give? Because I think it's just such an important topic.
Yeah, I completely agree with the answers that you've already just heard is fantastic. And I would say it's personal. It's your why. It's your why for medicine. And what makes it unique is it's your story, right? You're going to have a unique, precious, and unrepeatable story. And that's what we get from that personal statement. And it may be, what happened in your life or when you first had those inklings, you're sharing that person, that depth of thought. It's not just, oh, I want to help people, like a superficial line. It's like, well, how do you know that? And then so tell me a story why you know that. And that is where, so that's where I think it's you can convey like you'll say the thought, I want to serve people. Great. How do you know that? And so, I think the best way to do that is to tell that story or to tell a story in your life that actually supports that concept, or a struggle that actually then saw how you learned that or someone got you through that. And so that's why it's a unique personal statement. It will be unique to you. But I love reading those, some of the ones are just, they're powerful. In fact, this is one, and I share, I remember it was a cyclist who had been, he was training with his buddy for like several months, and they're in the middle of the, they're in this the mountain phase, and he crashes like 10 miles into it. And it's like a 150-mile bike ride. And he's with his buddy. He looks up, he's got 2 teeth in his hand. He broke his collarbone, and he's like, "Do I still go for this?" And he did. He finished the race, right? And so, but I was like, but it still struck with me because I'm like, man, this is someone dedicated, and they were sort of putting that in, like, hey, I've had these challenges, but I'm like, I'm gonna work for this, and I really want this. And I was like, gosh, that's who I want on my team, or in my group, when there's something pops up and I need help, they're not going to shy away from that. So now other deans may say, well, that was not a smart, you should have went to the hospital. So, everyone's going to look at it differently, like, well, that may not have been a good decision, but I think just share the story and it's real to you and it will resonate, when you get that.
Wow, that's quite the story. And Dr. Osborne, do you have any sort of stories about personal statements you've read that have really stuck out to you too, or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good personal statement is something that can kind of reflect on an experience. I like Dr. Amiri was saying, like, it doesn't have to, don't go for Hollywood knocking my socks off in that first paragraph, unless you have a Hollywood knock my socks off story, but don't try to create one if you don't have one. And so I don't need you to talk about how, you cured cancer 5 years ago or something like that. I want to hear about you, and I want to hear about why medicine, like they said. The opening intro, again, doesn't have to be narratively gorgeous. Like, I would just tell me why you want to be a physician. However, if you are going to tell me a story, I want to hear a reflection. And so I would recommend that everybody start journaling in their clinical experiences and think about days that you had where you felt icky, or where you felt really uncomfortable, or you saw something that was good, or you saw something that was negative. And I can think of so many experiences from my training where I had a pit in my stomach and I wanted to escape into the fire escape, and it was so uncomfortable. But in those moments, I really figured out something about me, something about medicine, something about what my patient deserves. For example, I had an experience one time where we didn't have an interpreter for a patient, and there was a huge miscommunication. And it was when I was a fourth year student, and I just remember feeling so sick in that moment. How am I going to solve this problem? But as a fourth year medical student, I was able to solve it. I got an interpreter, and we resolved the conflict. And I realized in that moment, patients deserve to have their spoken language, their native language spoken to them every single time they're in a clinical healthcare setting. And so that was like a revelation that I had as a fourth year medical student. And so if you can write about something like that you saw or witnessed in your clinical experiences, I would love to hear about that. I'll tell you some things that I hear about a lot, and it doesn't mean you can't write about this, but these are two things that we often make a joke at the admissions committee of, okay, well, this was this personal statement. So number one, I hear about grandparents a lot, and that doesn't mean that it wasn't very impactful to you, but just know that I hear about a lot of grandparents in personal statements. So just know that. And if you want to write about that, obviously it's not off the table, but it happens a lot. And then number two, this is a little naive to me when people write about this. They write about how they were diagnosing their friends with ear infections since they were 5 years old. And that's cute, but I hear that a lot also. And I guarantee that you can't know that you want to be a physician when you're 5 years old. It's a very complicated career. And so I want to hear about why now you want to be a physician, not why when you were 5 years old you want to be a physician.
And if Dr. Dan, if I could just add one thing, applying to the health profession, so, medical school, dental school, pharmacy school, we require a personal statement, and you don't have to have a personal statement for why you want to be a historian, for example, right? And so I think as you're thinking about the fact that we require this personal statement, it's so important to us, understand why it's so important for us and the privilege that exists in this role, right? And the vulnerability that you're dealing with, which is exactly what I feel Dr. Osborne was speaking about right now. So think about what you can tell us that is, again, your unique and precious story, as Dr. Leota mentioned, that captures who you are and why we're asking you to write this. Because what does that have anything to do with your ability to do the work? That's what the personal statement has to give us.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good point. And that's kind of why I wanted to chat about it so much, because it's really a chance for somebody to go beyond just the numbers and activities and to express who they are as a medical school applicant and candidate. So thank you for all of those answers. Dr. Amiri, while we talk about that too, a lot of what we've said so far has been sort of geared towards students who are close to applying to medical school. But, sometimes people realize when they're in high school that they want to become physicians. And, I know we have some people here listening in who are in high school or are just starting out in college and know that in a few years they want to be applying to medical school. So how can they prepare in advance to become successful applicants in the future?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Dan. It's a great question. And what you're doing at each stage of your career will vary depending on where you're at. So I think if you're in high school, one of the things that you should probably look at is take as much science as you possibly can. The more comfortable you are with the language of science and using science, the easier, hopefully, the transition will be for you when you move to the university or to the community college, wherever you start that post-secondary education, and you'll be more comfortable in that environment. It's really hard to get those types of clinical experiences when you're in high school. I mean, even I think ambulance ride-alongs, you have to be 18. And so find other types of service that you can be engaged with, understand what it means to try to balance your academic life with extracurricular life. That becomes challenging. And so if that's part of kind of what you're doing, you're developing those muscles and that skill set. We look for leaders and we look for leadership within the students that we admit to med school, because I think all of us are in the business not only of educating fine physicians, but also, leaders in the healthcare field. And so work on some leadership as well if you're in high school, right? So then you show up at the university, be familiar with your pre-med office, take the appropriate amount of science that you can handle. Sometimes, students are rock stars coming out of high school and the transition to university may be a little slippery. That's something that you can completely overcome, but why have to overcome something if you don't have to set yourself up for that? So have a good understanding of yourself and your study habits. And moving away from home is going to be a bit of a challenge for you. Maybe you're not going to take that heavy of a load that first semester just to transition in. By your sophomore year, you should have identified an organization that you want to be a member of, because not only is it important for us for you to be a great leader, we also want to know that you get along with your peers. And so with all of the peer-based learning and team-based learning types of activities that we have, and obviously you've heard more than once that being a doctorate is not a solo activity, and so you'll be part of a team. So we want to know that you're a good peer as well as a good leader. So you should have some kind of organization in place. Again, work closely with your pre-med advisors. Are you going to take the couple of gap years that Dr. Osborne wants to see, or are you just going to go straight through? And if you're going straight through, you're going to have to make sure that you've met all the requirements, right? And setting yourself up to take an MCAT. So it's a lot. Dr. Dan, we may need a whole separate webinar just to, if you're a freshman, do this, if you're a sophomore, do this, but it'll vary from time to time. Getting to know your faculty members so that you can ask for those letters. It's way more exciting for me to read a letter that says, I met this person in their freshman class and, chemistry, and I've known them for these 4 years. So you're basically setting yourself up. Understand the lay of the land, set yourself up so you can be successful, understand what resources you need, and then just get through the work.
Awesome. Thanks. And we have about 10 minutes left in this talk. So a few more questions that have sort of come in, and Dr. Osborne, I see you're answering many in the Q&A, so appreciate that as well. But something you touched on in one of your answers was actually about, sort of in-state versus out-of-state applicants, and, how that affects certain students. So, do certain medical schools look more for students from their own state, or, would you recommend students apply everywhere that they're interested in regardless? Like, how can someone make a list of medical schools to apply to that makes sense for them?
Was that question for me, Dr. Dan?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so we accept students from in-state, we accept students from out of state. I think the most common matriculants to our medical school are in-state, and that's just because we have cheaper tuition for those who are in state versus out of state, and because Californians tend to like to stay in California, so only for those reasons. But I don't think we necessarily look differently at the application. I think the one concern maybe some admissions committee members would have if you're applying for out of state is this person specifically interested in my program, or was I just on their list because they're applying everywhere? And so that would be the only thing that you might want to address. And so you might address that through your secondary application. There are specific answers, there are specific questions that are asked. And so if you can tailor those responses to state specifically why you're interested in UC Irvine or University of Vermont or the Uniform Services School, I think that that will help show that interest that they might take for granted if you are applying from out of state.
Awesome. And so, when applying, a lot of things are in a way like about numbers. So Dr. Leota, a question for you about numbers here. People think sometimes I need X amount of hours of something, right? Do you sort of subscribe to that notion, or do you say, if you shadow a little bit and you see that you enjoy medicine, that's enough? Or do you look for a certain amount of hours of shadowing or clinical work or volunteering, things of that nature?
Great question. And so we don't have an exact numbers, and I don't know many, it's going to be unique to that application. However, I do like to give numbers to you guys just because I think, if you think 90 is enough or 30 is enough, it's really how you describe that. But I do think it doesn't hurt you to have good numbers in those areas. And so I think a good ballpark is you definitely want to be over 100 hours, I think. And if you have over 300 hours, I think that's a great amount, especially if it's over several years, right? Say you've been working as a freshman all the way through your junior year, or you've done a great gap year where you've been working full time with it, you're going to have numbers like that. Now, does that mean you have to have 300? No. Could you get in with 90? You might, if the experiences you've had and the different things you've had. So I do think it's worth, that's why I give them out. And so, in general gestalted areas, I think even on a holistic review, we look at we will look at, hey, that's a lot of clinical experience. I mean, to see someone that's been an EMT all through college and they have 1,000 hours, it's just impressive, And so it speaks. Do you need that? Not everyone needs that, but it will enhance your application. And I think the way to look at it would be mostly like, are you doing what your passion is? Are you enjoying it? And if you've been committed to it for a period of time, over a year or long, you're going to automatically have big numbers there. And that's going to then translate to your descriptions of that experience, your recommendations from that experience, and your overall idea about what medicine entails with it. So yeah, that I think that sort of answers it, with it. And the same thing with, your service or your outside activities. Yeah. Is there an exact number? No. And in fact, and some people ask me, do I need a lot? And I'm like, you could have one activity. And if you've been doing that and been doing so much with that all through high school or college and or afterwards, that can be a very powerful experience. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot or a big number with that.
I appreciate that. Dr. Amir, do you have any comments on that as well? Just because I know it's such a point of stress and anxiety for applicants who feel like they may not have enough and they start comparing to other applicants.
So I'm going to agree 100% completely with everything that Dr. Leota said, because it's weird to have set hours for things because it ignores the context of the application, and that's the lived experience of the student, right? So if a person has to work 30 hours a week as an undergrad for food and shelter, clearly they're going to have less things on their application. And it's up to the school if they're going to take that into consideration or not. And if they don't, you know what, that school just does not deserve that student. That's all I have to say, right? Because if I can't take into consideration that you've had to work 30 hours a week to have food and shelter, and I'm all hung up on the fact that you don't have 127 hours of something, you probably don't want to go to school there. So I would say do the best to accrue the number of hours that make sense in the life that you currently have, and enough to be able to speak intelligently about something, right? So if I see that you only have, I'm going to pick something intentionally off just for it to stay, right? If you only have 10 hours of clinical experience and your whole essay is about what the characteristics of a good physician are, there's a disconnect there, right? So the application doesn't make sense. So I think it's important for you to have, as much as you can, clinical exposure and clinical experience in whatever way that may be. If it's possible for you to be paid to get that clinical experience, that's fine. It won't count as volunteering, and that's okay too, because we'll see the two. And agreeing with what Dr. Leota said about a particular one experience, that, I'm a civilian medical school, obviously, but when we get military applicants, they don't have a lot of things, but they have thousands of hours of service at the highest level of service that an individual can provide. And so that's leadership, that's service, that's everything combined together. And so for that particular application, I'm really only looking for medical understanding. And oftentimes they happen to be a military medic as well. And then that's all wrapped into one. So sometimes those applications only have 3 things on them, but it's, 15,000 hours of something. So really don't shortchange yourself and don't shortchange us. I mean, we want the students that fit our programs. And so we're going to take the context of you as an applicant into consideration. So is 750 hours better than 200? Sometimes it might be, and sometimes it may not, because if your 750 hours was you just going in there, robotically and doing stuff, and you haven't thought about it too much, it may not be that helpful. We want holistic. We want exposure to the field in various ways that you're able to share that with us is what we will value.
Perfect. And a few more minutes left. So I feel like we can continue talking for like hours and hours and hours. There's so many excellent questions people are asking. And Dr. Osborne, one that I wanted to ask you is something we haven't touched on the entire session yet, which is wild, I think, the MCAT. How much is the MCAT weighed and sort of viewed upon when you're looking at an application in general? Because there's so many parts of an application, but the MCAT is a big one. So what do you look at, when evaluating that portion of an application?
Yeah, so every medical school is going to be different in the way that they view MCAT. And so I'll tell you just my experience. So I think the MCAT is something that kind of gets you in the door to that secondary application. So we do have minimums at UCI for who we will send secondary applications to. And that's because it is very unlikely that someone who has a 480 on their MCAT is going to get into UC Irvine. If you look at our average MCAT, it's around a 515. And so I think it would be unethical for me to send you a secondary application if you have an MCAT that is well below what I would expect you to get in to our medical school. And so I don't want to ask for your secondary application fee if I think that it's very, very, very unlikely that you would get looked at by our medical school. So we look at all MCATs that have a very good positive predictive value for passing the USMLE. And so that score is probably around the 50th percentile nationally. And so those students who have gotten around the 50th percentile nationally or above, and it's somewhere in there, there's been a lot of literature that shows that they will be successful on the USMLE exam. And so our practices are consistent with that. And we have certain metrics and things like that in the subject areas. But I would say in general, we are just looking for a student who we believe can be successful in medical school, showing us through that score. But I'm not as interested in the exact score. I think students can be very, very, very successful with a 501. Students can be very, very, very successful with a 520 billion, whatever, the highest score is. Honestly, I kind of want someone like a little less smart than me so I can teach them something. So if you get a 528 on that MCAT, you're going to be having to tell me everything. And I don't want to have that all the time. So I'm just looking for I'm just kidding. Great job if you got a 527 on your MCAT. But I'm just looking for someone who's going to be successful. And I want to teach you if you've shown that you have that ability. So for me, the individual score isn't as important.
Perfect. And so we have 1 minute left, and I want to ask one final question for all three of you, and we can go sort of in order from Dr. Amiri to Dr. Liotta to Dr. Osborne. And in about 30 seconds, because we talked about a lot of different things, but in 30 seconds, could you give everybody listening here the one takeaway point that they should remember when it comes to being pre-medical students and applying to medical school from your perspective? The one main point, Dr. Amiri?
The one main point will be follow your passion and be yourself. So you're going to get a bunch of suggestions from different people. Filter that through, take the advice, but see how it fits for you, because you're going to be unique in the application process.
Awesome. Dr. Liotta?
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Amiri. It's just do what excites you. Don't do what you think you want us to hear. Do what excites you, and then it will shine. And you'll follow those passions, and then you're going to be happy. You're going to be happy in medicine because it's what you love and what you love doing.
And Dr. Osborne?
I think it's very common for us to be I'll be happy when type people. I'll be happy when I get into medical school. I'll be happy when I get into residency. I'll be happy when I meet my partner. I'll be happy when I get a house. I'll be happy when I pay off all my loans. I'll be happy when I retire. You know what? Just be happy now and enjoy this. This is a hard journey and it's stressful, and you have to make sure you're, getting letters of recommendation from the right people, but enjoy it. And especially when you get in medical school, please start living your life as I'll be happy now rather than I'll be happy 5 years from now.
Dr. Dan, can I just say one thing? And I feel bad saying this after this beautiful thing that Dr. Osborne just said, but I was scanning the questions. I didn't realize you were okay with us answering the questions. I saw a lot of repeated questions asking if such and such counts towards clinical. Don't look to us for that answer. You know what the word clinical means. If you're in a setting that care is being provided and you can understand things from that, then that'll be a clinical environment, right? So use your critical thinking skills, your analytical reasoning skills, take, again, general information and see how that applies to the thing that you're asking. Because the unique questions that you're asking individually to us may vary from school to school, right?
Yeah.
And be happy.
Be happy.
to keep going what Dr. Osborne said.
Well, the three of you have been incredible and clearly experts in pre-med admissions and medical school admissions. So your time is very valuable and we really appreciate you joining. After the session, I mean, we'll be able to send out information about how to get in contact with the three of you for everybody who's listening. But thank you so much. And to all the questions that we didn't get to, they'll be answered at some point, I'm sure. So thank you so much for all of those fantastic answers and everything you do to help people become doctors.